All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at how kids, specifically elementary school students, how those everyday interactions, like their friendships and disagreements, can give us a fresh look at how they actually learn about and practice citizenship.
We often think about citizenship like it's something you learn from a textbook, but these interactions, they're all about practicing those essential social skills and values right there on the playground, in the classroom.
It's like citizenship in action, happen in real time.
Yeah, exactly. So, with this deep dive, we're exploring what a peer relations approach can reveal about children's citizenship, how it unfolds in the classroom. And for this, we're diving into a really interesting research article. It's called Citizenship in the Elementary Classroom Through the Lens of Peer Relations.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting here is the focus on how these kids actually see each other, their relationships, their interactions.
It's like getting a kid's eye view of citizenship, seeing it from the ground up.
Yeah, exactly. And just to be clear for our listeners, the material we're drawing from today comes from a review article, and that means it pulls together a bunch of recent research findings from educational psychology.
Right. It's not just one study, it's like a synthesis of a bunch of different studies, specifically focused on how these peer relationships connect to what we want to achieve through citizenship education.
Okay, so let's unpack this idea of a peer relations perspective. First off, how do researchers go about understanding these complex kid-to-kid dynamics?
Well, a big part of it is how peer relations research systematically looks at children's behaviors and relationships. They use these things called peer nominations, or sometimes you'll hear sociometric methods or peer assessment.
Okay, and what does that actually look like?
Well, imagine you're a researcher in a classroom. You might ask the kids simple questions like, who in your class helps others? Or who in your class do you like the most? These simple questions give you a window into how kids perceive each other, who they see as helpful, who they enjoy being around.
So it's not just about asking teachers or observing from afar, it's about getting the kids' perspectives directly.
Right, because kids, they're like little anthropologists. They're constantly observing and making sense of the social world around them.
So you take all these individual responses and you start
Yeah.
to map out the classroom social scene, right?
Yep.
Like who's friends with who might be excluded.
Yeah, exactly. It's like building a social network map of the classroom based on how the kids themselves see it. And this allows us to understand the overall social dynamics.
So we can see who are the popular kids, who are the isolated kids, and everything in between.
Exactly. And from these individual nominations, we can then calculate these characteristics for the whole group.
Oh, okay. What kind of characteristics?
Well, one is called descriptive group norms, which basically tells you how common a particular behavior is in that classroom. Like what percentage of kids are seen as helpful or aggressive.
So a high descriptive norm for helping means that helping behavior is pretty common in that classroom, right?
Exactly. It's kind of like the unspoken rules of the group, what's considered normal and expected. Then there's density, which gives you a sense of how socially connected the whole classroom is. It's basically the proportion of actual nominations compared to all the possible connections in the group. So let's say you have a class of 15 kids. There are 210 possible liking connections, right? If we found, say, 64 nominations for helping, that's a density score of around 0.32 for helping. And what that means is that in this particular classroom, a good number of students are seen as helpful by their peers.
So it's like measuring how tightly woven the social fabric of the classroom is.
Yeah, exactly. A higher density, generally speaking, means a more connected group.
Okay, what's the third characteristic?
That's centrality. Centrality is all about whether nominations are concentrated on a few individuals or spread out more evenly.
So a low centrality score would mean a more egalitarian classroom where acceptance is more evenly distributed.
Precisely. If only a couple of kids get all the liked most nominations, that's high centrality. But if those nominations are spread out among more kids, that suggests a more inclusive and balanced social environment.
It's fascinating how much we can glean from these simple peer nominations.
And before we move on, it's important to clarify that while teachers are obviously central figures in classrooms, they're not included in the peer group in this type of analysis, but their relationships with individual students and the class as a whole definitely have an impact on the peer dynamics.
Right, and the classroom itself isn't an isolated bubble, is it?
No, it's embedded within society, so the norms and values outside of school also play a role in shaping the social landscape of the classroom. It's like a microcosm of the larger society.
Okay, so we've talked about how researchers understand peer dynamics, but how does all of this relate to the goals of citizenship education?
This is where things get really interesting. The article focuses on three key goals of citizenship education: solidarity, peace, and social cohesion. And the beauty of the peer relations perspective is that it allows us to connect these abstract goals to concrete behaviors and relationships between kids.
So we're not just talking about these concepts in theory, we're seeing how they actually play out in the day-to-day lives of children.
Exactly. So take solidarity, for example. In peer relations research, solidarity is closely aligned with the idea of pro-social behavior, things like helping, sharing, cooperating, basically acting in ways that benefit others.
So if a child is nominated for helping a lot, that's a sign they're demonstrating solidarity in a very real way.
Right. It's like seeing citizenship in action, not just reading about it in a textbook.
What about peace? How does that translate into observable behaviors?
Peace, in this context, is often looked at through the lens of aggressive behavior. And peer relations research distinguishes between two types: physical aggression, like hitting or pushing, and relational aggression, which is more about damaging someone's social standing, things like excluding, gossiping, spreading rumors.
So it's not just about physical harm, it's about the harm you can inflict on someone's relationships and reputation.
Exactly. And those kinds of social wounds can be just as damaging, if not more so, especially for kids at this age. Now, the article points out that just having low levels of aggression in a classroom doesn't automatically mean there's true peace. It's more nuanced than that.
Right, it's more complex than just the absence of conflict.
But the point is that nonviolence, reducing those aggressive behaviors, is an essential foundation for building a more peaceful classroom environment where other peace-building behaviors can develop. It's like creating a safe space for positive social interactions to flourish.
Okay, so fewer nominations for aggression could be seen as a positive step towards a more peaceful classroom dynamic. What about social cohesion? How does that connect to the peer relations perspective?
Well, social cohesion, that sense of belonging and having positive relationships in a community, is directly related to how kids experience acceptance and rejection from their peers.
So those liked most and liked least nominations become really important indicators.
Exactly. By looking at those patterns of acceptance and rejection, we get a sense of how included children feel within their peer group, which is a fundamental part of social cohesion.
It's about feeling like you're a valued member of the group, that you belong.
Precisely.
Okay, so we can see how these big ideas about citizenship show up in individual children based on what their classmates say about them. Now tell me, what are some of the differences between individual kids?
Well, one of the consistent findings from peer relations research is that there are big differences between individual children in how much pro-social behavior they show.
Meaning, some kids are just naturally more inclined to be helpful and cooperative.
It seems that way. Like if you look at nominations for who helps others, some kids might get a ton of nominations, while others might get very few, or even none at all.
It highlights how even within the same classroom, kids can have very different social styles and tendencies.
Absolutely. And you see similar variation when it comes to aggressive behaviors. Some kids might be seen as rarely engaging in aggression, while others might be perceived by many classmates as acting in ways that disrupt the peace.
So some kids might be seen as peacemakers, while others are seen as more prone to conflict.
And that's reflected in the number of nominations they receive for those behaviors. You might see a huge range, even in a relatively small class.
It's interesting that these different patterns can coexist within the same classroom.
What's also interesting is that pro-social and aggressive behaviors aren't always perfectly inversely correlated. In other words, a kid who's seen as helpful might still sometimes engage in aggressive behavior.
So it's not always a clear-cut good kid versus bad kid situation.
Right. The reality is much more nuanced than that. Some researchers suggest that both types of behavior, pro-social and aggressive, can be used strategically by kids to achieve social goals. Like maybe they're being helpful because they want to be liked or seen as a good person. Or maybe they're acting aggressively to gain power or status.
So the motivations behind those behaviors can be quite complex.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that while both types of behaviors can be used to navigate the social world, pro-social behaviors are generally more positive and contribute to a healthier classroom environment.
It's about encouraging kids to use those pro-social skills like helping and cooperating to achieve their goals rather than resorting to aggression.
Right. Now, when we look at social cohesion at the individual level, what we see is that there's also wide variation in how much acceptance and rejection each child experiences. Some kids might not get any nominations at all, while others might be nominated by almost everyone in the class.
That's a pretty stark contrast in social experiences.
What's also interesting is that there's a pretty strong negative correlation between acceptance and rejection, meaning kids who are highly accepted tend to be less rejected and vice versa.
So it's like being on two ends of a social spectrum. Either you're generally in with the group or you're generally out.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about these individual behaviors, but how do they actually connect to those experiences of acceptance and rejection?
This is where things get really fascinating. Research consistently shows that children who are nominated more for pro-social behaviors, things like helping and sharing, tend to be more accepted and less rejected by their peers.
So being a good citizen in the classroom actually translates into greater social acceptance.
It seems that way. And what's really interesting is that this link is even stronger in classrooms where pro-social behavior is already the norm.
So in a classroom where helping is common, being helpful gets you even more social points.
Exactly. It's like those positive behaviors are especially valued in environments where they're already prevalent.
It's almost like a positive feedback loop, where kindness breeds more kindness.
Yeah, I like that. On the flip side, the research also consistently shows that kids who are seen as more aggressive, whether it's physical or relational aggression, tend to be less accepted and more rejected.
So those behaviors that disrupt peace in the classroom, they also tend to lead to social isolation.
And that makes sense, right? If a
Yeah.
kid is constantly being mean or disruptive, their classmates are probably less likely to want to be around them. However, there are a few exceptions to this pattern, and those exceptions are really interesting because they show us that the social context really matters.
Okay, what are those exceptions?
Well, some studies have actually found a positive link between aggression and acceptance, but this usually only happens in very specific classroom environments. Like, for example, in classrooms where popularity is very concentrated among a small group of kids, or in classrooms where aggressive behavior is generally accepted or even admired.
So it's like in some social circles, being tough or aggressive might actually increase your status.
Unfortunately, yes. But it's important to emphasize that this is not the norm. In most cases, aggression leads to social isolation.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about how things like gender, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status might play into these patterns of citizenship we see in the classroom.
This is a really crucial area because we want to make sure that citizenship education is promoting positive relationships across all kinds of backgrounds.
We want everyone to feel included and empowered to participate.
Exactly. And when we look at gender, what we often see is that boys are generally seen as more physically aggressive and less relationally aggressive and pro-social compared to girls.
That kind of aligns with some common stereotypes we hear, but is it really accurate?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? It could be that these differences reflect actual variations in behavior between boys and girls. But it's also possible that those stereotypes we have about boys being tough and girls being nice are influencing how their peers perceive them and nominate them for these behaviors.
So maybe boys are expected to be more assertive, and that's interpreted as aggression, even if their intentions are different.
That's definitely possible. And there's also the fact that kids tend to form friendships primarily with others of the same gender, which could create biases in how they view kids of the opposite gender.
It's like they're seeing the world through a gender-segregated lens.
In a way, yes. But it's worth noting that this gender segregation tends to decrease as kids move into adolescence, as their social circles become more mixed gender.
What about ethnicity? Do we see similar trends there?
This is a sensitive topic, but it's important to talk about. Studies in the US and Europe have found that, unfortunately, children from minority ethnic groups often face challenges in terms of how they're perceived by their peers. For example, Black children in the US and children from non-Western immigrant backgrounds in the Netherlands tend to receive fewer nominations for pro-social behavior and more nominations for aggressive behavior compared to their peers from the majority group.
So even within the classroom, they might be experiencing the effects of broader societal prejudices and inequalities.
It's a sobering thought. And this is further supported by research showing that kids tend to have stronger social connections with peers who share their ethnic background. Rejection across ethnic lines is more common than rejection within the same ethnic group.
Which suggests a preference for similarity, a kind of in-group bias.
Exactly. However, it's important to note that the ethnic composition of the classroom itself can influence these patterns. So it's not just about individual biases, it's about the social dynamics of the group as a whole.
It's like the classroom environment can either exacerbate or mitigate those biases.
Right. And finally, when we look at socioeconomic status, what the research tells us is that children from lower SES backgrounds tend to be perceived more negatively by their peers. They're more often nominated for aggressive behavior and less often nominated for pro-social behavior and acceptance.
So they might face additional hurdles in terms of social inclusion and feeling like they belong in the classroom.
It seems that way, but more research is definitely needed in this area to fully understand the complex ways that socioeconomic factors intersect with peer dynamics and citizenship development.
Okay, so we've talked about individual students and these broader demographic factors. Now let's zoom out again and consider how we can understand citizenship at the level of the entire peer group, the classroom as a whole.
Right, so here we go back to those group-level characteristics we discussed earlier: descriptive norms, density, and centrality. These give us a broader picture of the social environment in which these individual interactions are taking place.
And those norms basically tell us what's considered normal behavior in that specific classroom, right?
Exactly. Like, how common is it to see kids helping each other? How common is it to see aggression? Research suggests that pro-social behaviors, like helping, might show up in about 25–30% of possible peer nominations, while aggressive behaviors, thankfully, are usually less common, maybe around 5–20%.
But the key is that there's a lot of variation between classrooms.
Exactly. Some classrooms might have a much stronger culture of helpfulness and cooperation, while others might be more conflict-ridden.
Okay, and then density tells us about the overall connectedness of the group, right?
Right. Density is basically a measure of social cohesion, how many connections exist between students. And again, there's a lot of variation between classrooms. Some are very tightly knit, others are more fragmented.
And centrality tells us about the distribution of acceptance, whether it's concentrated on a few individuals or more evenly spread out.
Exactly. Low centrality means a more egalitarian classroom, where social status is less hierarchical.
So it's like looking at the overall social structure of the classroom, whether it's like a pyramid with a few kids at the top or more like a flat, interconnected network.
Precisely. And all of these group-level characteristics create the social context in which individual students are developing their understanding and practice of citizenship.
So it's like the individual and the group are constantly shaping each other.
That's the key takeaway here. And research suggests that the norms of the peer group can actually influence how individual students behave over time. Like, for example, if you put a kid who's not very pro-social into a classroom where helping behavior is really common, they might actually become more pro-social themselves.
So the social environment can have a real impact on individual behavior.
Absolutely. And conversely, if you put a kid who's generally pro-social into a classroom with a lot of aggression, they might start acting more aggressively themselves.
It's almost like they're adapting to the social norms of their environment.
And this is especially concerning when you consider that in some classrooms, aggressive behavior can actually be rewarded with social status.
So the tough kid becomes the popular kid, which reinforces those negative behaviors.
It's a vicious cycle. But on the other hand, research suggests that classrooms with high density and low centrality, classrooms that are well connected and where acceptance is widespread, tend to promote more positive citizenship behaviors. In these environments, there's less of an incentive to use aggression to get ahead, because social status is less hierarchical.
So the structure of the peer group itself can either support or undermine pro-social behavior.
Exactly. And this really highlights the importance of understanding these group dynamics and thinking about how we can create classroom environments that foster social cohesion and positive social interactions.
And of course, we can't talk about the classroom environment without talking about the role of teachers. They're such influential figures in shaping how kids experience and learn about citizenship.
Absolutely. Both citizenship and peer relations research really emphasize the responsibility of teachers in creating socially supportive environments and encouraging active participation from all students.
So it's not just about teaching the curriculum. It's about creating a classroom culture that supports those citizenship values.
Exactly. And a key takeaway here is that teachers are constantly, whether they realize it or not, communicating messages about citizenship through their everyday interactions with students.
They're modeling those behaviors and setting the tone for the whole classroom.
Precisely. And when we look at how teachers interact with individual students, the research shows that supportive teaching practices, where there's less negativity and more encouragement, are linked to higher levels of perceived pro-social behavior in those students.
So if a teacher is consistently supportive and positive with a child, their classmates are more likely to see that child as helpful and cooperative.
That's what the research suggests. And on the other hand, the way a teacher manages aggressive behavior in the classroom can also influence how aggressive a particular child is perceived to be.
So if a teacher reacts harshly to a child's aggression, it might actually make that child seem more aggressive in the eyes of their peers.
It's possible. And even subtle things like when a teacher praises a child can have a ripple effect on their social standing. Praise can act as a buffer against relational aggression, while reprimands, even if well-intentioned, might unintentionally fuel it.
So the way a teacher responds to a child can really shape how their classmates view them.
Absolutely. And when it comes to acceptance and rejection, studies have shown that negative relationships between a teacher and a student can actually predict lower levels of peer acceptance for that student.
So if a teacher is constantly clashing with a child, that child might be less likely to be liked and included by their classmates.
That's the unfortunate reality. And this highlights the idea of social referencing, where kids look to the teacher as a kind of guide for how they should view their classmates.
It's like they're taking cues from the teacher about who's good and who's bad.
In a sense, yes. But it's not always about negative interactions. Teachers can also actively promote positive perceptions of their students. Like simply highlighting a child's positive attributes can increase their acceptance among their peers.
So it's about consciously using their influence to create a more inclusive and supportive classroom environment.
Absolutely. And when we look at the teacher's impact on the peer group as a whole, what we see is that their behavior can also influence those group-level characteristics, like descriptive norms and density.
So the teacher's actions can actually shape the social climate of the entire classroom.
Exactly. For example, classrooms where students perceive their teacher as supporting more of their peers tend to have higher levels of pro-social behavior overall.
So a supportive teacher can foster a more helpful and cooperative classroom culture.
And conversely, classrooms where students perceive more conflict between the teacher and their classmates tend to have higher levels of aggression.
So a teacher who's constantly clashing with students might unintentionally create a more conflict-ridden environment.
That's the unfortunate implication. Additionally, teachers who are seen as actively discouraging aggressive behavior tend to have classrooms with lower levels of aggression overall.
So setting clear expectations and boundaries can make a difference.
Absolutely. And even how a teacher talks about learning and achievement can influence the social dynamics of the classroom. Like when teachers emphasize the importance of effort and improvement, as opposed to just focusing on grades or ability, it tends to create an environment where pro-social behaviors are more valued.
It's like shifting the focus from competition to collaboration.
Precisely. And interestingly, research has also found a link between teacher behavior and those measures of social cohesion, like density and centrality.
So how a teacher interacts with their students can actually affect the overall connectedness and the social structure of the classroom.
That's what the research suggests. Classrooms where students perceive more teacher support for their peers tend to have higher density, meaning greater social connectedness. And conversely, classrooms with more perceived teacher-student conflict tend to have lower density, meaning more social fragmentation.
It's like the teacher's behavior can either bring the class closer together or drive them further apart.
And when it comes to centrality, the research shows that classrooms where students feel more individually supported by the teacher tend to have lower centrality, meaning a more egalitarian social structure.
So when a teacher makes each student feel valued and seen, it can create a more balanced and inclusive social environment.
And on the other hand, if students perceive the teacher as favoring certain students over others, it can actually increase centrality, leading to a more hierarchical social structure.
It's like the teacher's distribution of attention and support can have a real impact on the social hierarchy of the classroom.
Exactly. Even when teachers actively try to promote friendships between students, it can actually lead to lower centrality, suggesting that encouraging those peer connections can contribute to a more balanced and inclusive social environment.
It's fascinating how all of these factors are interconnected.
And it really highlights the profound influence that teachers have on the social and emotional development of their students.
Absolutely. So given all of this research, what are some of the key takeaways for teachers? How can they apply this peer relations perspective to their own classrooms?
Well, I think one of the most important takeaways is that teachers need to expand their understanding of their role in the classroom. It's not just about delivering academic content. It's about being aware of the subtle messages they're sending through their everyday interactions with students.
They're not just teaching math and reading, they're also teaching citizenship, whether they realize it or not.
Exactly. They're constantly modeling behaviors and shaping the social and emotional climate of the classroom. And the research highlights three key ways that teachers influence citizenship: by demonstrating citizen-like behaviors themselves, by giving students feedback on their positive and negative social interactions, and by indirectly communicating their value of students through their interactions, which in turn affects peer relationships.
So it's about being mindful of those subtle cues and using their influence intentionally to create a classroom culture that supports pro-social behavior and social cohesion.
And another key takeaway is that teachers can actually use data from peer assessments, those nominations we talked about earlier, to get a better understanding of the social dynamics in their classrooms and reflect on their own practices.
So it's not just about relying on their intuition. They can actually use data to inform their approach.
Exactly. And they can even use this data as a starting point for conversations with their students about what citizenship looks like in their everyday lives and how they can work together to create a more positive and inclusive classroom community.
It's about empowering the students to take ownership of their social environment.
And finally, it's important to emphasize that a teacher's ability to create a positive and supportive classroom climate is crucial for fostering those open and honest conversations about citizenship, especially when it comes to sensitive or controversial topics.
It's about creating a safe space where students feel comfortable sharing their perspectives and engaging in respectful dialogue.
Exactly. And all of this really underscores the importance of teacher training that specifically addresses the social and emotional dimensions of teaching and how those everyday interactions can have a profound impact on citizenship development.
It's about equipping teachers with the tools and knowledge to not only teach the curriculum, but to also cultivate a classroom culture where every student feels valued, respected, and empowered to participate.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a truly deep dive into a really fascinating topic. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of what's happening in elementary school classrooms.
Me too. It's amazing how much we can learn by taking this peer relations perspective.
So to sum it all up for our listeners, what's the most important thing to remember about this approach to understanding citizenship?
I think the key takeaway is that the everyday interactions between elementary school students, their friendships, their disagreements, their acts of kindness and aggression, all of it provides a really valuable window into how they're learning about and practicing citizenship. It's not just something that happens in a textbook or during a designated lesson. It's happening all the time in those informal social interactions.
It's that idea of lived citizenship that we talked about earlier. Kids are constantly experimenting with different social roles and behaviors, and those experiences are shaping their understanding of what it means to be a member of a community.
And it leaves us with a lot to think about, especially when we consider the powerful influence of teachers and the importance of creating classroom environments that support pro-social behavior, social cohesion, and positive relationships across all kinds of backgrounds.
Absolutely. And as the article highlights, there's still so much more research to be done in this area, particularly in developing more sophisticated ways to measure citizenship skills through peer assessment and in understanding how these dynamics evolve as kids get older and their social worlds become more complex.
It's a fascinating field of study with so much potential to inform how we can better support children in becoming active, engaged, and responsible citizens.
Well, thank you for shedding so much light on this important topic. It's really given us a lot to ponder. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful. Until next time.